Hello there and welcome to the Bitcoin Takeover podcast. This is season 17, episode 38. We are live with Keags, also known as Mr. McClelland, Keagan McClelland, and he is a developer who has worked for Lightning Labs. He's a co-founder of Start9 Labs. I think right now it's only called Start9, and he works on all sorts of interesting stuff. As far as I'm aware, he also worked with Jeremy Rubin on some CTV, Sapio, whatever, which was not as successful as expected for reasons which concern not upgrading Bitcoin, at least not yet. And that's kind of the reason why we're here. So it's good to have you, Keags. Let's talk about Bitcoin development.
Great to have you. Great to be on.
Yeah. So where do we start? How does your Bitcoin journey begin, and how did we get here?
Well, let me. So my Bitcoin journey began in 2017, I think. No, 2015. It's the first time that I actually encountered Bitcoin. I was at a new location. So I graduated school in 2015. I had a degree in computer science. I actually studied cryptography and distributed systems back when I was in school. But I had moved to a new city, and I wanted to acquire some goods of questionable legitimacy, as is often many people's early Bitcoin journey. And so, in the process of trying to buy, stuff on the internet using, I had to find Bitcoin. I had to because this was 2015. There were no other altcoins and the darknet markets were essentially just run entirely with Bitcoin. And I didn't really know or have any other context for it at the time. But when I stumbled upon it to use to buy the stuff, I wanted to I scratched my head. I was like, what is this thing that I am looking at? And because I had that cryptography and distributed systems background, I knew I kind of was able to understand some of the subtler points of what was going on. And I found myself very interested in it. At the time, I think Bitcoin was trading at $230-ish or something like that. And once this transaction was over, I essentially forgot about it for a couple of years. I still had some Bitcoin on my Coinbase account back then. And so it was enough for me to still pay attention to the price for the following couple of years. But it was very, very passive. It was I had a whole bunch of stocks as well at the time. And so it would just be one of those things that I would check up on maybe weekly. But otherwise, really didn't pay attention to it. Then in the March timeframe of 2017, this is kind of in the early days of the ICO bubble. The price started to not just fluctuate, but actually started to go up a bit. And that attracts a lot of attention, and it was no different for me. And so I started paying attention to it again. And this at this time I was working for Amazon, and so I was working on some of the website stuff. But over the course of the ICO bubble during 2017, I slowly found myself more and more captivated by the various technologies that were in play. Because this is also when Ethereum really started to the flippening narrative for the first time started to come on, which is when the ICO bubble started to happen. And so every project was publishing a new white paper every week, and they had massive variance between the quality of the top ones and the white papers. I hesitate to even call them white papers at the bottom end, right? They were just cash grabs. But during the summer of 2017, instead of doing my work at Amazon, I was procrastinating doing that by reading cryptocurrency white papers. And at some point I just had this realization. I was like, I'm pretty sure I could get paid for doing this instead of not doing the work that I'm supposed to be doing. And so I left Amazon to go join a cryptocurrency company. This was Salt Lending back at the end of 2017. So that's kind of where my entrance into the space came in. I can give you like the full history if we want to keep going on that, but I'm going to turn it over to you for a second.
I remember Salt. I think it was sponsoring the Bitcoin conference in 2019 or something. I was watching the live stream and their logo was showing up on the screen. So I think it was a pretty big deal for its time. I'm not sure if it's as big anymore or if it's still around because I haven't heard about it in a long time. But I think that's a good way to enter the space. It was a pretty good job, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, so salt lending was at its core a collateralized lending platform. It wasn't really like a novel take on cryptocurrency in general. And so, but you know, they did a token launch. That's how they raised their money, et cetera, et cetera. And it was, you know, I'm grateful for it because it just gave me the opportunity to enter the space. But during my time there, this is actually how Start9 eventually formed. But like we kind of became dissatisfied with some of the leadership as they were increasingly like orienting the company towards trying to preserve the token value instead of like trying to build a legitimate product with real customers. It's not that they weren't trying to build a legitimate product, it's just that their priorities were messed up. And so as towards I want to say early 2019 to mid 2019, a bunch of the core engineering team left, and then we spent a summer trying to figure out what to do instead, and Start9 is what came out of that.
I think I've had Matt Hill a couple of times to talk about sovereign computing and the stuff that he's doing with Start9. I don't think I agree with him too much nowadays because he's a very hardcore supporter of BIP110, but on the other hand, I can't blame him for being on the side of his customers. Like, I do get where he's coming from. But I think it's a very interesting company, and you're a co-founder in that one. And I think you stuck around until 23 or something
It
when
was, yeah,
you
2022. Like right, actually, yeah, it was
No,
the
you're right,
very
22, because
yeah,
Jeremy Rubin tried to do a speed trial for CTV, and it
yep,
was, I think, 22 when that happened, and that's when you discovered Judica or Sapio,
yep.
one of these two, and you decided that it's much more interesting than what you're doing at Start9.
So so part of what I the like my background is in cryptography and distributed systems. And so I've always been interested in protocol development. I also have an interest in finance. And so this is why cryptocurrency in general and Bitcoin very specifically have managed to capture my attention for such a long time. Start9 was an observation, or like it was founded on the observation that it took way too much effort to set up a Lightning node. And we wanted to essentially give the one-click install experience to installing various types of server software in a way where the like no one thinks of themselves as a server admin when they are using their phone, right? Or like systems administrator. But that is what's happening when you're installing an app from an app store on your phone. Like you're doing some very basic systems administration. It feels very intuitive. It feels very accessible, and that was the experience we wanted to give. The trouble is that as the logical progression of a company whose goal is that is definitely much more towards operating systems development, like UX stuff and like infrastructure. And my background and my interests were much more at the protocol level. And so as that kind of became clear and the company started getting like momentum in that direction, it didn't make as much sense for me to stay on. And so, you know, as a result, I ended up leaving and joining Judica to work with Jeremy on Sapio. And that was actually kind of a long time in the making because back when Start9 got started, it was during the summer of 2019 and Bitcoin 2019. And that's when I met Jeremy. And this is back when CTV was called, so check template verify, which is like a covenant opcode. I'm not sure how much I should go into explaining all the details.
On this show, you can present all the details. There's no limit to
Okay.
that.
Right. So I'll just give the overview. Like, you know, check template verify is an opcode that has been proposed for Bitcoin's consensus rules. But it used to be called Op Secure the Bag, and like Jeremy was giving a presentation in 2019 on one of the Bitcoin main stages about it, and I just remember noticing that the construction of that opcode would allow what are called like finite state machines on Bitcoin. And a finite state machine essentially allows for basic smart contracting. And that has always been something that's interesting to me, right? I want to see a world where more finance is permissionless, or at least we eliminate unnecessary points of trust. So you can imagine like in like equities trading, when you're like trading stocks and stuff like that, there's no way that you can eliminate the trust point with the equity issuer. So if I'm buying Apple stock, that is fundamentally a contractual relationship between me and Apple. But the broker that I might use to buy it through, like say Schwab or Fidelity or whatever, like that is an intermediary that's not strictly necessary. And so even like if we took the Bitcoin approach to try to like disintermediate all sorts of different like financial actors, it can still improve things. Like you don't have the same level of trustlessness that you might get in Bitcoin proper, because there is still a counterparty to that contractual relationship. But the more third parties you can get out of that relationship, or the more that you can make everything permissionless, you can increase accessibility, you can increase globalization, and those are things that were interesting to me at the time, and largely still are. And so when I noticed this, like when I noticed that you could have finite state machines and that would allow like a bunch of basic smart contracting, it had just sort of captured my attention. And that's when me and Jeremy met. That's when we had started talking about it. And I had been sort of a quiet, or not, I mean, yeah, relatively quiet supporter from like as early as I can remember. This was even also back when Taproot was first being discussed, or like first being published, right? So it was kind of a long time in the making, and that just happened to be the right time to do the switchover.
Yeah, to me it's interesting that what you described is like the earliest pitch for Omni, which used to be called Mastercoin in 2014, and also Counterparty, which was on Bitcoin, and initially it served the purpose, or at least it was designed for the purpose of trading stocks and commodities and having this removal of the middleman for as much as they possibly can. But ironically, it ended up being useful, or used mostly, for creating the earliest meme coins, which were rare Pepes and Spells of Genesis. And I also have my collection. It's called Bitcoin Heads. Check out btcheads.com if you want to see it. And it's a bit unfortunate, right? Because we design systems with the best intentions of doing something serious and real business, and then they sort of become absorbed by the community's culture, and they become something funny, because maybe the institutions are not taking us very seriously, or maybe that something else is going on that diminishes the importance of these inventions.
Well, the institutions can't really take us seriously to start. Like, it's tempting to think that it's their fault, but it's they're dealing with infrastructure that is valued in the billions or the hundreds of billions of dollars. And it doesn't mean that you can't trust new technology. It's just that, when this technology doesn't really have a single accountable party, it makes it something that you can't really fast track. And so as a result, you kind of have to depend on the Lindy effect, which is this idea that like the longer that something has existed, the longer it's likely to exist, uh, in order to trust something. And like you kind of see this even in Bitcoin, right? Where at first everyone thought it was nonsense or nothing interesting or rat poison or what have you. And then eventually, like we have ETFs trading, like many like very well capitalized ETFs trading the asset. And that took a long time. And just trading the asset is like one piece of it, right? It's going to take even longer before you start putting the core technologies into load bearing infrastructure for civilization. And that's assuming everyone's intentions are good, which I think we well know that there's some subset of the people running the existing financial infrastructure who are well aware of the dynamics of all of this and have a very vested interest in remaining in whatever their seats of power are. And whichever levers they decide to pull in order to maintain that, they might try to co-opt it, they might try to fight it directly. It's unclear, and that landscape's constantly shifting. But yeah, like to your point, you can't really start out with a serious application for technology that's so new, because you have to play with it before you can start to do something serious with it.
That's a fair point. I didn't look at it this way. It's just that early in the development cycle of something, the use cases being presented are usually the most serious and the ones that are most capitalized on markets. And then there's a gradual degeneration of the actual use cases, because the market is going to discover what it's actually good for and what it's actually unique for. Because I don't think you could do rare Pepes in a different environment using a different kind of technology. So
You cannot. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And so it's truly novel, which means it has no alternative, and so it's going to use this technology in order to do it. Whether that technology, or sorry, whether that use case is valuable or not is a separate question. But if you can't do it anywhere else, and you wanted to do it at all, it's going to show up here. And secondly, is that there are a lot of problems with the existing financial system, especially but around the world, you see the fastest adoption of Bitcoin in the regimes where the financial system is the weakest. And as much as we like to complain about it here in America, when you consider all of what it allows you to do, our financial system is actually pretty good, all things considered. It's not perfect, and it's really imperfect in some really important ways that make me mad. It makes a lot of other Bitcoiners mad. But when you consider the fact that it facilitates a lot of trade and it's relatively stable, it does function well. And so there's a sense of well, if it's not broken, don't fix it. And the ways in which it's broken are super subtle. They require very heady arguments a lot of times. And so it doesn't necessarily appeal to a lot of people very quickly unless they have a propensity to think about these things really deeply, or some people try to take it upon themselves to meme it into existence, and that's where you get things like Bitcoin fixes this, or this is good for Bitcoin, et cetera, et cetera.
yeah, we talked about your journey. You started out with Salt, obviously used Bitcoin before. Then you went and co-founded Start9, and your next venture was working with Jeremy Rubin. But after this, and this is sort of the main reason why we're here, is that we disagreed on Twitter at some point about the success metrics of the Lightning Network. And you went on to get a job at Lightning Labs. But before we get to that, let me give a shout out to the sponsors and also announce that there's going to be a giveaway in maybe 30 minutes to 1 hour, depending on how long this conversation is going to be. But basically what I'm going to ask you, Keags, is to write down a number from 1 to 100 and not reveal it to me or anyone else. And people in the chat will have to guess it. The first person to guess it will get $100 in Bitcoin from Cake Wallet. Cake Wallet is a sponsor of this. They have a cool wallet. Go ahead and download it. It's free. They have features to buy gift cards, to buy debit cards that are non-KYC. It's pretty interesting. They enable a lot of use cases in that small piece of software, which is just a wallet with nice UX. Another sponsor is OrangeRock, where you can trade without limits. If you're into trading and you don't like KYC and you don't like limits on your account depending on how many documents you upload, OrangeRock is exactly what you're looking for. You have a lot of trading pairs. You have even the option to use leverage if you think that you're smart, but I don't recommend it. It's basically gambling, and you're 99% likely to get liquidated, but you do you, whatever. Check out orangerock.com. They have the iOS app, Android is coming out, and also desktop. Also, LayerTwo Labs, they're launching the drive chains, and apparently it's no longer gonna be a soft fork, but a hard fork that's coming in 3 stages, as Polestor's announced in the previous episode. They're sponsoring the show. I'm quite interested to see where the technology is gonna go and what the market thinks about it. And everyone is gonna get free Ecash coins depending on how much Bitcoin they own. So I guess the message here is that Over the next couple of months, you should get as much Bitcoin as you can, and then claim your free Ecash, and then you're free to sell it on the market to get more Bitcoin. Or you can try the technology to see if there's any future to it. Maybe it's going to be worth much more than the launch price in the future. The website for this is ecash.com, and that's where you have all the questions answered about how this works. SideShift.ai is where you should swap your stablecoins, because as much as we tend to think that they're convenient and they serve the market, well, what's the term for it? Like the market fit? Something along these lines. Anyway, as much as stablecoins are liked, they are censorable. And every week there's a new report from Tether that they freeze some funds. Circle does it too with their USDC. If someone wants to pay you in stablecoins and you want Bitcoin and they don't want to change their option, and you're like, I just want Bitcoin, go to SideShift. You put your Bitcoin address in there, you click the swap button, you send the stablecoin address to the person wanting to pay you, and what you're gonna get is Bitcoin to your wallet. No gas token required. You don't have to worry about that. Good liquidity, low fees. Check it out. Sideshift.ai. And last but not least, Braiins mining, which is the original mining pool, used to be called Slushpool, and now they have a service that's called Hashpower, where you can rent hash rate, and it's going to be very interesting and useful over the next couple of months. When we have two hard forks launching, one of them seems to be abusing the Hashpower service because the Bitcoin University guy is telling them to rent hash rate to make it look like there's more demand than there actually is. I think they're going to change their proof of work algorithm anyway, but until then you can still use it. And Ecash is going to be 100% shot to 56, so that's going to be interesting too, to see how this plays out. So hashpower.braiins.com, you can do whatever you want with the hash rate. You can even try to 51% attack B-Dash or Ecash or any hard fork out there. Have fun. Now let's go back to Lightning. Keags, where do you want to start with this? You want to talk a bit about your journey to getting hired by Lightning Labs?
I mean, so like if you recall from earlier, the origin story of Start9 was really around it being too difficult to start up a Lightning node. Obviously, the use case was a lot more general, but we were all very interested in trying to get Lightning up and running, especially in the wake of the block size wars of 2017, and that's kind of when I had like really just showed up on scene. And so Lightning was a very promising technology, and we were all very interested in it. I continue to be like pretty interested in it as well, and it was like so when I left Judica, I was actually really burned out. I took 6 months off to just kind of regroup and figure out kind of what I wanted to do. And then it was like at that 6 month mark that I decided to get back into the industry. And Lightning Labs is where I ended up going. I ended up working on L&D for the entire time that I was there. But there's a certain beauty to the Lightning construction. It requires very little out of the base layer Bitcoin, and it has a couple of key observations in terms of like what makes it trustworthy, like as in like, what its trust assumptions are, at least at a high level. And then from there, you get not just a scaling factor in terms of scaling, like it's not just like, oh, I get like 10x throughput or 100x throughput. It's that it's a complexity class change, right? Whereas before the Lightning construction, the amount of economic activity you could get out of a Bitcoin transaction was a certain amount. But now a pair of transactions in Lightning enables an infinite number of transactions between those two counterparties without having to settle to chain necessarily. Now, there are other constraints, like obviously the net flow of funds can only be up to the channel capacity that were opened, that was opened. But you are no longer limited by the number of distinct transactions on that channel. And that, like, scaling solutions that behave like that are unusual. Further, what's another really interesting thing about Lightning compared to Bitcoin is that every transaction on the Bitcoin network is known to everyone, but not everyone's fundamentally interested in every transaction, right? We need to know it because we need to stay in consensus, because we need to know who owns what, and there's no other way to solve it. But like, technically speaking, if I didn't need to, I shouldn't really want to know about every transaction that goes on the network. It's too much for me to pay attention to. It's, a privacy violation for, anyone who is trying to transact, right? But it's a necessary evil in order to maintain consensus in a distributed network. What's interesting about Lightning is that the transaction data between the counterparties who are responsible for transacting is like isolated to those nodes. And so it puts the responsibility of data maintain, like ownership and maintenance, on the parties for whom it's directly relevant. And that's, in my opinion, like a very good design compared to something like side chains or, Ecash mints, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, so the payment channels you think that are good for privacy, which obviously is very much true. They're also scalable in this regard, but
And they're scalable with the right incentives, right? So, like I said, the people who for whom like the responsibility of data carrying is with the same people who suffer when that data is lost, right? It's not like I'm storing your data and that if I lose your data, you're just screwed and, it was my fault. It's that if I lose my data, I'm screwed, which like keeps all the right incentives in the right places. You don't have these moral hazards.
right, but if you look at the Lightning white paper, it does say that in order for it to function at scale, it needs 133 megabyte blocks.
Sure. I mean, like, it depends on what you mean by at scale, right?
Well, here it says if all transactions using Bitcoin were conducted inside a network of micropayment channels to enable 7 billion people to make 2 channels per year with unlimited transaction inside the channel, it would require 133 megabyte blocks, presuming 500 bytes per transaction and 52,560 blocks per year.
Yeah. I mean, so if I may, it sounds like what you're implying with that statement is that, well, obviously this can't work. Is that more or less what you're saying?
Well, it can't work assuming that everyone opens their own channel and is completely sovereign, because as we have seen, Lightning is more popular as a custodial solution where people just delegate the channel opening to somebody else and they trust that they're not gonna get rugged.
So I would agree with that. I would say in any technology history, or like any arc that has like some technology going from zero to like full market penetration, it has to go through a number of revisions. And so to the point of you saying like, yeah, we can't just say, hey, Lightning is the final design for Bitcoin, and then everybody gets sovereign, like a sovereign Bitcoin setup. It's very clearly the case that, it would require substantial block size increases. And I don't even think, I think there are actually even a number of limitations within the Lightning Network that people are not really all that aware of, because they require like pretty substantial, like high dimensional math arguments in order to make work. But they're like, they it can't, in its current design, scale to that level. But it doesn't mean that it didn't unlock a new scaling era. And so I think a lot of work is going to have to get done either building on top of or next to Lightning in order to get it to like 7 billion people. But I'll also say that like reasoning about it in these endgame scenarios is useful to a degree, but I think you have to remember also that like only 4 billion people even have access to the internet. And the internet was started, 30-ish years ago. So these things take a long time. And if you were to try to say back 30 years ago, like, hey, this design is not going to scale to like 7 billion, or is it even 4 billion people, right? If you were to look in the mid 90s and say like, hey, we're going to put like gigabytes of video every single day, everybody's going to be flooded with, shorts of YouTube and TikTok and, Instagram 30 years from now, and like 4 billion people are going to be on the internet, like the people who were the most bullish on it back then would probably still say that you're crazy. And so I think it's useful to remind people that it is the continued work over decades, and it's not like a few silver bullets, but like it's a tiny, it's a massive number of tiny improvements over and over and over again that allows these technologies to scale.
Well, I agree with that, but in order to achieve this, we had to get more centralization because the petabytes, or I don't know, a lot of data that's getting uploaded in shorts on TikTok and YouTube, that's being hosted on centralized servers belonging to a company. So there's nothing decentralized about it. And also,
About the
maybe,
internet.
yeah, maybe you can call it scaling, but it's more like bloating because it took advantage of the developments in hardware for storage, for memory, for access memory, and everything concerning processing. So it's the hardware that improved and enabled us to get to this point. It's not like we are still running on 1990 something infrastructure and we are able to get the petabytes of video because we wrote much more elegant software. So in a sense, it is Moore's law
It's
that helped
both.
us get here.
It's definitely both. Like obviously the hardware is a major component of it, but various protocol developments since the 1990s, as well as like improvements to like operating system stuff, and like improvements like I guess the GPUs are like a form of hardware, right? So just a bunch of technologies that didn't necessarily seem directly related to one another kind of conspired or like sort of mixed in together in order to be able to create this scaling property. Now, I will admit, like, yeah, obviously there was some centralization, and but I don't think that the architecture of the internet is fundamentally not decentralized, right? It still is at its core a decentralized piece of technology, and you can get onto the internet. Like I can stand up a website with a computer in my home and an internet connection. Like it doesn't require necessarily me going to some provider. The providers are there because they make the process easy, and because not everybody wants to like learn how to do these things. Or even for the people who do know how to do these things, that they actually provide genuinely valuable services in terms of like maintenance or like connectivity, uptime, etc. In the meantime, that or like it would take a long time for me to replicate on my own. And so I think all scale admits some centralization, but the admission of some centralization does not mean that the underlying architecture of the system is fundamentally centralized. Does that make sense?
It does. Maybe it's fair. But I was thinking in the context of Bitcoin that we're still using arguments from a decade ago to explain why it should not scale in any way or why it should not improve. And in some way it's detrimental, but if you look at it from a different perspective and you're looking at the Bitcoin forks or clones or whatever, which are fulfilling different purposes, you can argue that we are in fact scaling, but it's not on Bitcoin per se. It's happening on Ethereum, it's happening on Zcash, Monero, whatever. So it's like a tiered list of scaling layers for Bitcoin. Of course, they all have their own separate tokens, so they're not proper sidechains, but they are fulfilling features and maybe some stuff regarding scaling that Bitcoin does not have.
Are you saying that people are using Zcash as like a method of scaling Bitcoin, but it's just like a different like I guess I'm not quite exactly following what you're saying.
Well, for example, if you're using Zcash today, You have integrations with something that's called near intents, and you can make payments directly from shielded Zcash into Bitcoin to somebody else's wallet, and they're gonna see that the money comes from this liquidity pool, which does not reveal how much the sender owns or where the money comes from specifically.
Sure.
It's just a liquidity pool. So this is actually a Bitcoin use case that comes from Zcash.
Yep. Yeah, and I don't see a problem with that necessarily. I mean,
No,
I
the
am
only problem is that this could have been directly on Bitcoin, but we did not build it, or
well,
we found
so
justifications to not have
uh,
it.
maybe it could have. But before we unpack that, I want to ask this question of like, I think a lot of people say like, oh, but it's not on Bitcoin or it is on Bitcoin. Like, first of all, what exactly do you mean when you say on Bitcoin? Like, at the end of the day, Bitcoin is a technology that touches a bunch of other technologies, like especially like other internet protocols. And so, to some extent, there's this. I get the sense that there's this feeling of like, oh, like we can't allow any value to accrue to any other like cryptocurrency network. And it's, you know, I get that people don't necessarily want to invest a bunch of effort into these alternative protocols, especially if the incentives of like those protocols capitalization is one that's like not super ethical. But this idea that there can only be one cryptocurrency, like I'm somebody's gonna call me a shitcoiner for this, but like it's like I am kind of a pluralist.
No, it's fine. On this show, you're not gonna get called a shitcoiner. I'm a
I mean, like I'm
shitcoiner.
also
If
okay with
anyone wants
being
to call
called
me
a
that, put it on me. Okay, I'm the
shitcoiner.
shitcoiner. I'm the one perverting you right now to say things that maybe you don't believe in.
I mean, no, I will only say things that I believe in. My point is that while my interests are fully like focused on trying to make Bitcoin better, and I'll explain that actually, it's that my my point of view on the very like at the end of the day, what I care about most is like the freedom to transact and have like financial sovereignty. And whichever technology gets us there is the one that I prefer. Now, I do think that there are massive incentive problems with various like the incentives around ICOs and other types of like new token creation are generally speaking not good. Um, Mostly in the way that they're marketed, not the simple creation of new tokens, but the fact that like people misrepresent what it is or what it could be and sort of prey on people's uh, desire to get rich without doing any work that is like it allows them to essentially cash grab from people. And I think that that's really really bad. But creating new technologies and putting a lot of effort into them and making them valuable and such that they actually solve real problems, especially when the real problems that they're solving are increasing people's like individual autonomy, is a good thing, right? And whether that's Bitcoin or anything else is, like I'd rather it be Bitcoin because I own a lot of Bitcoin, but like it's not necessarily like freedom is freedom. So that's the first piece. The second piece is that like the what the monetary maximalists have right is that all else being equal, for a medium of exchange or a money, so to speak, there's a gravitational well that sucks liquidity into it, right? It's better to have one network where you can reach everyone rather than have your assets like broken up across like 4 or 5 networks where some subset of everyone is on each network. Like I think everyone actually intrinsically understands this now because like I don't know how many people have tried to use chat apps in 2026, but you have like 6 to 10 different chat systems that you could try to reach someone on. And it's really fucking annoying, right? You're like, oh, do I talk to this person on X? Do I talk to this person on Telegram? This person on Instagram? This person's on WhatsApp? Like, it's annoying. And if it all accrues to a single network, it would be nice. Now, it doesn't tend to because each of these chat apps have something to offer that the other ones don't. People have different preferences, but there is this gravitational well that sucks it into a handful of, or one, network. And money, I think, is even more strongly that way. But like we've had monetary pluralism forever, right? Like Forex trading long preceded the existence of Bitcoin. And so, yeah, it's useful, obviously, for everybody in a who lives in a particular economic context to transact using the same medium. But like, if you go to a different location, and you can almost view like moving from one cryptocurrency network to another one, that you're sort of like moving countries on the internet, if you could even think about it that way. But you're moving from one economic context to another economic context. And yeah, these bridges between them, they're annoying to use, but they do work to some extent. And so as a result, because of this gravitational well, it's like, okay, Bitcoin is the biggest, which means that all else being equal, it's the most likely to succeed because it has the biggest gravitational well. So let's try to focus on making Bitcoin work and be able to satisfy as many needs as possible in terms of like being able to transact at scale. And that's like why I am most interested in Bitcoin and continue to spend all of my effort and attention on it.
That's fair, but I have a couple of questions that come from what you just said. The first one is, do you believe, obviously, when something launches and it's brand new, it's sort of fair to call it a shitcoin. It doesn't have much proof of work behind it. Everything that we have is just the promise
Yep.
of achieving something, and there's not much proof of work. There's not much of a community. You just have some trading, and that's kind of it. But do you believe that after a couple of bear markets where it survives and it manages to find its own, what the expression I was searching for before was product market fit, but I could not come up with it.
Yeah.
So when something finds its own identity and its own place in the market, do you think that it stops being a shitcoin, or is it still a shitcoin because it's not Bitcoin?
So I don't use the term shitcoin because its only function is to do in-group signaling. Now, I will say, per the Lindy effect, right? The things that survive longer are likely to survive. So it depends on what you mean by shitcoin, right? If you mean an overt scam that is only going to make you poorer, right? Like obviously, any new project uh, is going to more likely to be a scam than something that can survive a long time. Mostly because over time, scams get sussed out and then they die. Even if they come back with like new faces, like the scam with the old face, like kind of tends to die out. And so as a result, like I don't think that I think anybody who tries to call Ethereum a shitcoin is just like not thinking very critically about it. And I'd probably even start to put Solana in that bucket too. But I don't know enough about Solana to know about its like technical strengths and weaknesses. But these things have been around long enough that they they can't survive with no substance. Um, that's just my belief. Like I happen to have that belief a little bit more strongly about Ethereum because I understand Ethereum more towards its core, but I don't really about Solana. And so I don't want people to sort of take that as an endorsement. But my own heuristics about this are like, per what you're saying, like if something exists for long enough, especially under like serious adversarial pressure, right? So it's been in production, it's survived many bear markets and it hasn't died, that it increases its likelihood of its soundness. Now, that doesn't guarantee it. And this is actually one of the main reasons why I think that Bitcoin still, like is the king in this way, which is that in Solana's case, it's definitely true that the founders are still around. Ethereum, it's also true that the founders are still around, although the Ethereum Foundation recently sort of made this kind of major transition of stepping away from like the actual like protocol development, and that kind of kicks it into a new era. Bitcoin has been that way for a while, and so there's a meaningful difference in like these. You're talking about bear markets. That's one form of pressure. There's another form of pressure, which is the leadership that started the project has left. Can the project continue to sustain itself in any coherent way in absence of its original leadership? And if it like, Bitcoin is still kind of trying to find its way there, right? Like we obviously have a ton more evidence that Bitcoin can do this than Ethereum can because, we've just been doing it longer. But that doesn't mean that Bitcoin really has a very sound and repeatable process for changing itself for like for improvement, or just like running itself in any like understandable way, like, you know, after Satoshi left. But at least it's doing it, right? Like we have had what, I don't know how many, but at least 2 soft fork upgrades since Satoshi left. And you
No,
know,
I
and a
think it's
stat,
like 7, honestly.
yeah. So I mean, I'm mostly, like I said, because I showed up in 2017, like I'm only really familiar with the SegWit and Taproot hard or soft forks. And so, but the point is that the network has changed over time in very serious ways that required a lot of people's buy-in, right? Like there's so many people who have a vested interest in Bitcoin, and them being able to all coordinate these changes at that scale with no central leadership is a big deal. And any like value transfer network that wants to have that sort of like level of respect needs to be able to solve these problems at some point. And some of them will, and some of them won't. Some of them will continue to lean on their existing leadership because, you know, honestly, having central leadership is an advantage in some ways, right? But it's a disadvantage in others, right? Like it makes you less likely to trust it because you don't know what the founders are capable of doing. But it makes it more agile, so it can change when it needs to, and adaptability is useful for any organism in any environment.
Yeah, for the record, because I made a claim, I just looked it up. I'm gonna mention some soft forks that happened before SegWit and after Satoshi. One of them is pay to script hash, which is BIP16. There's BIP66 for strict DER signatures. There's check lock time verify, BIP65. There's CSV, BIP112, which stands for check sequence verify. And then there's SegWit and Taproot. So we at least have these that happened over the years. But my second question, because I promised a couple of them that stem from your previous statement, my second question is connected to the fact that you said you want to focus on developing Bitcoin. And it concerns this concept of consensus. Because we have the best of intentions, we go to conferences, we talk on every technical mailing list and forum and IRC chat and whatever. And we spend a lot of time advocating for something to happen. And it seems like it's getting some momentum and some traction. And then you try to go towards activation of this idea. And then you hit a wall that says you don't have technical consensus or whatever. And then you're gonna ask yourself, well, how do you even measure that? Or how do we even get there? And then people will say, well, technical consensus means that there's nobody from the technical community that's going to have a major objection about what you're saying, or that it's not controversial. And that's very hard to achieve. It's almost like the difficulty bar has been raised so high that we only sort of agree when a very narrow group of people make a proposal. And historically, SegWit and Taproot have come from the same group of people. And everything else that came from outside of it hit this wall where it could not get activated. And I'm more specifically referring to Jeremy Rubin with his CTV, which is BIP 119, and Paul Stort's BIP300, which has been around for almost 10 years. They've tried in their own separate ways to make this happen.
So what you're saying about consensus is true and super annoying, right? It kind of there is the bar will continue to raise. It has raised and it will continue to raise. And as someone who is on the progressive wing of Bitcoin, if you will, like I am interested in getting good changes in. Um, it is a frustrating process to encounter. Giving a charitable reading to the other side, as the network has scaled, more people have more of a stake, and so the bar should raise for that. There's also this difference between technical consensus and like user consensus. And this is where like the dynamics of like soft forks and hard forks, and even that's like not up to the proper level of resolution that you would need, because you can have soft forks that are very invasive, and you can have like non-invasive soft forks as well. And so technical consensus is honestly, as much as it might feel like it's not at the level of like clear understanding as you would want, in my opinion, is it easier to understand than broad user consensus. But in either case, there's no measurement, there's no voting system. It's really, it's more of like a real politic type of thing where it's just like consensus is achieved if you can get the change to happen, right? It's like almost, it's a little bit of circular reasoning. But it does require like buy-in from different people, right? If a bunch of people are in broad agreement about it, then they'll say good things about it. They'll sort of advocate for it on their own, especially if they have differing interests. And then if no one is seriously advocating against it, uh, then you end up kind of having that consensus as an emergent property there. But all it takes is like one person to sort of present some sort of like loud counter argument. And now everybody has to figure out whether that counter argument has legitimacy on the technical level. And if it does on the technical level, whether or not the implied values are something that they agree with. Because that's the other thing, right? I'm going to actually sort of use this as like an opportunity to introduce a little bit of the BIP110 drama, because I think it's a good case study.
Oh yeah, it is.
It's that, let's say that in every BIP that gets put out, there is a motivation section, and then there's like the actual design. So motivation is like a values-based thing. It's that the whole rest of the proposal follows as a design to get this goal to occur. And so there's two different things that have to go on here. Number one is, does the design of the BIP or the code change, I mean, like this happens even at the software level too, does this design, the set of choices that we make technically, satisfy the goals we set out to? And then there's a second question of, do I agree with the goals? And then that's just contained within the document itself. Then there's a separate question of like, okay, are there other consequences of these technical changes that I might not agree with? Or are there other vulnerabilities in this design that were not considered in the document, right? In the case of something like BIP110, it's that there isn't, in my opinion, the BIP design does not satisfy its own goals. And I also believed that its goals were incoherent. So very specifically, the spam is like, this BIP was designed to deter spam. And so on the first level, I don't think spam is a coherent idea in a permissionless network. Like, who gets to decide what spam is, right? Like everyone says, oh, I know, I can't define spam, but I'll know it when I see it. And like, that's a fair enough thing, but like, you're you, and then there's someone else. And what makes yours better than theirs when there's no one in charge? So the goal is incoherent to start with, but let's just admit for a second that even if we had like this magical oracle that says this is spam and this is not, does the design that was given actually make the does it actually cause those goals to be achieved? And the answer is very much no. There's this brilliant Twitter account called like I can't remember who he is, but he did like that day the BIP110 Advent or something like that, where like every single day he would publish a new method of embedding data into the chain that passed the BIP110 filters and did not, that sort of violated their general understanding of what spam was. And for anybody with a solid understanding of information theory, like this should be obvious. I don't expect everyone to have that, but I do expect everyone to, who doesn't have that solid understanding of information theory, to at least know that they don't have that understanding of information theory. But it's like when you understand that all of the data in the chain is there because it's supposed to like create these records of what did or did not happen, and if there's any variability with like those data fields, then you can tweak and grind the various data fields in order to be able to embed any data that you want. Or you can have some sort of interpretability layer on top that can look at various what do you call, like data embedding formats in the chain and be able to extract this higher level meaning out of it. And this is unavoidable, fundamentally unavoidable, like down to raw information theory. And so when the BIP 110 people say like, hey, this needs to be passed, it's very difficult for me to look at it and say, yeah, we should do this, because the design can't satisfy the goals. The goals are incoherent. And not only can this design not satisfy the goals, I'm not sure any design can satisfy those goals. In fact, I'm pretty sure no design can satisfy those goals. And so it's like, that's when you get these sorts of like technical consensus breaks where people notice this. And I think it's in BIP 110, it was very obvious. The trouble is that there's a lot of people who think that this is like a conspiracy. And like, I don't know what to do about that, right? If you don't want to do the work of trying to understand the underlying how the system works underneath, and you simply just want to say like, hey, I want to fire this set of people who's responsible for maintaining this network, and restore power to the people, so to speak. It's like, you can try to do that, but at the end of the day, the systems that you build do have to work. And the people who take the responsibility of learning how to make systems work will learn the underlying parts of those systems. And when you can't, like, if you don't know how the system works, then you're not going to be able to change it, period. Like, that's just a fact of reality.
I agree with a lot of what you said, except that you interpret BIP 110 as a technical proposal, when I think it was more political or social, in the sense that people just sort of got behind this guy who's a bit crazy, admittedly. And they said, well, this guy is going to show us the way to, first of all, have consensus in which our nodes are more important than the miners. And to be honest, I think this was part of the Blockstream propaganda, or their side of history, where they promoted this UASF, which was like this sacred event that happened in 2017 that forced activation of SegWit. It's not exactly what happened. It was actually the economic nodes, which meant companies and exchanges agreed to support the SegWit activation, and therefore they pushed the miners to activate it. It's not like Bitcoin is working in a way where you spin up 1,000,000 nodes and then you're gonna get control of the network. Satoshi was smarter than to enable this kind of attack. But it seems like these people were very much...
I would not, hold on. I do need to interject right there. I don't think that Satoshi, you can view, it's tempting to view Satoshi as this like all-knowing person, right? I think he was just trying to figure it out. I think collectively, the technical community in 2026 in aggregate knows an order of magnitude more than Satoshi did back then, right? So
well,
I don't.
Of course, because we also have the benefit of retrospect,
Yes,
and we
of
can
course.
learn from the past
Of course.
experiences. But also, what was I gonna say about this? Go on, and I will remember.
I mean, you were saying you can't spin up a million nodes and like make changes to the network like that. And it's true. And it's because, what do these nodes do? They facilitate economic activity, and it's the economic activity that's valuable, right? Everyone likes to focus on money, but it's actually like, money is just a means of facilitating the trade of the things that are actually valuable. It's everything else that matters. So in some sense, the people who have the power over the network are the people who have all the stuff that isn't money, but that are plugged into that monetary network. And so this is like, these nodes with economic weight. If you are, and it's not just that, oh, I have a lot of money or a lot of like non-money capital assets. It's that I am making trade decisions of those assets contingent on the ledger entries of this monetary network. That is actually what gives it the weight. Because if I had like, I don't know, a bunch of farmland or something like that, but I wasn't trading it around, maybe that farmland is worth like $1 billion, and I also run a Bitcoin node. But if I'm not trading that around, then that economic weight doesn't really matter. And as a result, you have to ask yourself the questions like, in aggregate, where is the economic weight in the Bitcoin network right now? And unfortunately, I'm not happy about this, but the reality is that the exchanges hold a lot of it. The miners hold another piece of it, although the miners have less power because they're squeezed between like the margins of like their like electricity and what they actually have to sell. So they're in a little bit less of a strong position on this. Various merchants, but there's not really merchants who are conducting business at scale with Bitcoin. And so at the end of the day, like the various like layer 2 implementations, those actually matter too. So like it's these things that end up governing what the actual activation of consensus are. And this is where there's a difference between different types of soft forks, right? I talked about invasive versus non-invasive soft forks. So like something like Taproot or SegWit, where we pick up a new script version opcode, and then we only put like the new transaction semantics in that new script version, and that script version wasn't used before. It means that if you don't upgrade, you're going to just proceed on and you're going to stay in consensus very easily. And the fact that we are making these anyone can spend transactions invalid under certain circumstances doesn't really change that, because nobody was using them anyway. And if they were using them, then your node was just going to say like, hey, I don't recognize this. I guess it's okay. I'm going to move on my merry way. So in that sense, BIP 110 is also technically a soft fork, but it's a very invasive soft fork, right? In fact, its whole purpose is to be an invasive soft fork, because the whole purpose is to combat activity that is already happening on the network. This is not the same thing as a Taproot or a SegWit soft fork, where it's not there to combat activity already on the network, but rather to give rules and regulations to currently unclaimed land, so to speak, on the Bitcoin network. And because of those differences, the UASF dynamics are completely different.
Yeah, I've remembered what I wanted to say, and there are multiple points. The first one is that people reading the white paper, they're gonna read about nodes, and at the time there is no distinction between a miner and a validating node. Like, all the validating nodes were miners early on. So there was no actual distinction between them. This actually happened after Satoshi, when we realized that it makes no sense to try to mine from your CPU anymore, and they removed the mining part from the Bitcoin Qt later core client. And the other confusion that people make is that they assume that the mining pools and the merchants and the exchanges are not also running their own nodes. Because some people running nodes feel like they're super important, and without them, there wouldn't be much of a network, and that's not entirely true. All the actors that are interested in receiving Bitcoin or facilitating Bitcoin activity, they run their own nodes. And the fact that you run your own to verify your incoming transactions, that's very cool. But it doesn't mean that you're someone who's very important in the network. It's just another computer that's copying the ledger and is validating all the transactions, but there is no actual value that you're providing to the network. You're providing value to yourself as a user, but the network really doesn't care about your Raspberry Pi. And that's like a very hard pill to swallow for a lot of people, because they have been sold an entirely different story where they are like the most important part of Bitcoin, and the miners are sort of like their servants, service providers that are collecting their revenue but otherwise are not important, and that's not true. The miners can activate soft forks if they want without asking any permission from the nodes. All they
And
require
without
is a
anyone
majority.
actually knowing what occurred. That's the thing, is that miners can activate invisible soft forks, technically, right? If they implement a rule set that no one else knows about, then you'll just see certain transactions never get mined. They'll get relayed because like all the nodes might not be aware of this rule set, and so they'll just sit in the mempool indefinitely. But if miners just refuse collectively to either mine them or mine on blocks that include them, right? You actually have to have both in order for a soft fork to work. Then yeah, you can have that. Now, some people will call that a 51% attack, and I think that that's a fair characterization. But miners do have essentially unilateral authority as a block to execute soft forks. I don't think we want that, right? I don't think we want the miners to be able to collude in that way, just because I think that a lot of other bad things can result from that. But they are the power to enforce soft forks. They have the ability to do it on their own without anyone else's permission. Now, the user activated soft forks can force the miners to activate the soft forks, but at the end of the day, it's like the people building the chain are the ones who decide what history is. And as like, and so while we have these like levers in order to influence that block is very responsible for deciding what the rule set is, or deciding whether or not it can be constrained. They can't really effectively loosen the rule set. Like, this is why soft forks are so popular compared to hard forks. Like miners cannot unilaterally enforce hard forks.
Yeah, and there's another point that stems from here and led to a lot of misunderstanding, especially on the BIP 110 camp. I think Luke Dash Jr. uses words in a different way, and they mean something entirely different to him. And for him, a soft fork is not an optional upgrade where the rest of the network can ignore it and just some participants can activate that. For him, a soft fork is a hard fork that happens over the long term. It just means that instead of having this set date where everyone upgrades, everyone's gonna upgrade to the latest version over 6 months, 1 year, or whatever. And for him, that's what a soft fork is about. Being
I think
able.
I think that's actually right to an extent, and it's not like, I don't think that it's truly optional, because if it was, things can get really weird and bad over time. So as many problems as I have with Luke's rhetoric and the way that he talks about it, I think that there's a lot of truth to that particular statement.
Okay, but for a long time, soft forks were presented as something completely optional that you just can choose to opt out of.
Opt out of in what sense?
It means that you can ignore the soft fork and you're still gonna be in consensus with the network. And there are people running 2013 era nodes and they're still in consensus. I mean, before
That's
the Berkeley DB hard fork.
so that's true. So that's also true, right? So when Luke says it's not optional, it's like not optional at scale, right? You do still need a critical mass of people who are going to enforce these rules, because otherwise you just get really like bad chain destabilization. Um, and so yeah, if you're like an island, if you're like in a remote part of the Bitcoin territory, so to speak, and like you're still running a 2013 era node, you will stay in consensus if enough of the other nodes. It's like a herd immunity thing, right? Like you've kind of heard this in like epidemiology, where not everyone needs some vaccine for some like disease to be eliminated from the population, but you do need a critical mass of it in order for you to, or like not necessarily vaccine, but like even just immunity from having had the disease. The point is that if a critical mass of it is in the population, then not everyone actually needs it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that like no one needs it, because if no one does it, then you don't have the immunity. And I think it's the same thing is going on here for like soft fork enforcement, which is that you need a substantial amount of the weight to enforce it, right? Not necessarily, it's not node counts. It's not necessarily hash rate. I mean, like it is to an extent hash rate, but you just need a critical mass of the network in order, like to actually enforce it, in order for you to remain safe as someone who doesn't. And that's why when I think Luke says it's not optional, it's like, well, if you want to be fully responsible for staying in consensus, you do have to enforce all of the rules of consensus.
Yeah, I was reading the chat to see what people are saying. There is a guy named, and I want to acknowledge this because he spent a lot of time arguing with us, Smart Mark 23, and he's just in disagreement all the time and tells us to go back to reading the white paper. And there's also someone who asks you how much Bitcoin you own, and that's always a funny question. Like, what's your best answer for that?
I'm not going to answer that question.
I usually answer that I own 21 million, but I lost the private keys.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's just like that is a, you know, I care about privacy. I work on privacy technology. I'm not answering that question. What is the going back to reading the white paper in response to?
There's like a long chain of messages. Like he says, dude, where did you find this clown? This is bullshit. No node has quote unquote economic weight. It's just another node on the network. And I did censor some words here. He seems very angry at the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, that's not an argument though, right? I mean, so I will say this, like economic weight is not something that can be easily measured, right? It's not it, but it's a real phenomenon, right? Like I'll give you an example. So if I am part of like I don't know, like let's say I'm trading steel like internationally or something like that. And you know, I accept Bitcoin for some shipment of steel and someone sends Bitcoin using a transaction that doesn't make it into the main chain because, or doesn't make it into the chain that my node sees. And then I refuse to ship them the steel because I haven't received the transaction, then that has real world consequences. And so when people are starting to reason about that, they're saying like, hey, well, the major steel producer that I am buying from doesn't support this. And like, you know, to the tune of like, let's say I move billions of dollars of steel or whatever, then like that means that if this doesn't stay in consensus, like real economic activity gets disrupted. And that happens, that is going to cause like influence the debate around what consensus should be a lot more than if I'm running a small like Etsy store or something like that where I make little trinkets and sell those for Bitcoin, right? So it does matter how much like economic volume runs through you when you use your node to make decisions about what has occurred with respect to the ledger.
I
And so,
think
yeah, it
that's a
is
much more
just
balanced
another node on the
explanation.
network. Like on some level, that statement of just another node on the network is right. But like when it comes down to like the real dynamics of like how consensus changes, it's like, yeah, it's just another node, but like some nodes are more equal than others, unfortunately, right? Actually, I mean, I don't know if it's unfortunate. It's unclear whether that's like a good or a bad thing. And I'm sure in different contexts it might be a good or a bad thing. But it just is. That's just it is how it works. Forget what it ought to be. It just that is how it works.
Yeah. I can also think of decisions which were taken by the core team without consulting with economic nodes. For example, making RBF a default. I remember I had a debate between the CEO of Bitrefill and Peter Todd. Peter Todd is the
Yep.
creator of RBF, and Sergey Kotlyar is the CEO of Bitrefill. And Sergey was like, you know, why don't you just give us the option to choose whether or not we want to accept zero conf? For him, it was more of a matter of why don't you let us use Bitcoin Core, the latest version of it, in the way that we want, as opposed to imposing onto us this rule. because he said that if he cannot use ZeroConf anymore for Bitcoin, he's just gonna support more altcoins to fulfill the same purpose, because Litecoin has ZeroConf, Bitcoin Cash has ZeroConf, and he's like, if I want to deliver gift cards very fast, I can't wait for one confirmation. But that's just one tiny example where a decision was made without considering. So for context, Bitrefill has one of the largest Lightning channels and was possibly
Even
the
the earliest
first.
ones too.
Yeah, was the first company in the space to open the first one BTC Lightning channel back in the day, when I think the amount recommended by Lightning Labs was 0.04 to avoid losing funds. And Bitrefill was like, we're just gonna open one Bitcoin Lightning channel. And I think they still have that. So it is a big economic node, but it didn't have much say in this decision.
Well, that's because RBF is purely a policy thing. It has nothing to do with consensus, right? So for the audience, like there is a difference between relay policy, which is the rules that you have to satisfy in order for your transaction to be relayed to the next node, and consensus, which is in order for your transaction to be allowed to be included in the next block when the block is published. And those two things are different. And they, there are people who are more like technically proficient than I am, who have this opinion that like policy has an important role beyond consensus. But as far as like I'm concerned, I don't see the point of having policies that are more restrictive than consensus, because at the end of the day, consensus is the law of the land, whereas policy is just, it's like a thin layer that may provide like slightly better heuristics, but it's like it's not very reliable, especially in the era where you can do direct submissions of transactions to miners. It means that policy doesn't, using policy to prevent the relay of a transaction is not reliable, because if you really wanted to get your transaction included, you just do direct submission and call it a day.
Yeah, there's someone else in the chat who has a question, and after this, I'm gonna ask you to reveal your number. So Plastic O2D says, what does Keagan think about transaction fees? Do they work? And I think what he means is that whether or not we're gonna be able to sustain the Bitcoin economy, which has a diminishing block reward every 210,000 blocks, which is approximately 4 years, whether or not we're gonna be able to sustain it with just transaction fees.
That is my favorite question, because if there's anything that concerns me about Bitcoin's future, it is that. The answer is I don't know. I do know that in order for them to work, we have to enable a massive amount of economic activity on Bitcoin. And this is like, on one hand, you do not want transaction fees to be a substantial percentage of the economic value being transacted, because it, in some sense, degrades the value of the network, period. If you can view it as like transmission lines. Like if I have power or data transmission lines and like there's like a 10% loss across that line, it's like less valuable than something that's like that has 5% or 1% loss over transmission. And so we have to solve two problems that are kind of working against each other. Number one is that we have to have a sufficient amount of transaction fees in order to justify the mining costs. That can be, there is an open question of exactly how much hash rate is required to quote unquote secure the Bitcoin network. But generally speaking, I think most people can agree that the hash rate declining over time is not a good thing. Now, maybe we can sustain a modest decline in the hash rate, or maybe even a serious decline in the hash rate, although I don't think so. Like I personally get very, very nervous about the idea of hash rate ever declining more than 50% off of its all-time high. And the reason for that is that if there's more hardware that is usable for mining sitting on the sidelines than there is on the main network, that's when 51% attacks start to become like much more viable in ways that you can't necessarily predict. So that's my personal threshold for something like, I'm not sure if the network can sustain this. So if we let it fall 51% off of its all-time high. I don't think that's a good thing. So you kind of have to, it might be this kind of, I don't want to say like pyramid scheme, but the point is that like you kind of like you have to have this perma growth, or like at least being able to sustain the existing hash rate. And doing that in a declining block reward regime means that you have to like compensate for it with transaction fees. And so if you are doing that, then you need to actually make it valuable to transact on the Bitcoin network, period. And this is where things like custodial solutions actually work against the network in that way. And so some of these incentives might work toward like together in order to be able to find some kind of an equilibrium, but it's like very not obvious exactly how that's going to go down. To me, the more that we can enable economic activity that actually does result in chain, like in bytes submitted to the base chain, the better. But we really would like to do it such that, like, we can pack billions and billions of dollars of economic activity into a single block, and then that way the block can pay, $1 million or something like that, and it's like 0.1% of the economic activity transacted. And so this is where things like Lightning, not necessarily exclusively Lightning, but it packs a lot of activity down into a certain number of bytes. And the more that we can do that kind of a thing, then you can have on a byte for byte level high transaction fees at the base layer, even though the transaction fees themselves are distributed across much, much larger chunks of economic activity. So you don't have large transmission loss at the level of actual trade of goods and services in the economy.
Well, yeah, I really like this explanation, but on the other hand, we also came up with sub-Satoshi fees, which was not part of the norm, but I think last summer people decided that it's fine to just have much smaller transaction fees, zero 0.1 Satoshis per VByte, so that's 10 times less than they were paying before.
With respect to relay policy?
Yes, and this is also an interesting precedent because once it gets to a certain point where a transaction fee is, let's say, $10,000, what's gonna prevent people from deciding that, okay, maybe that this is too much, let's just cut it by 10x once again?
Well, you're not cutting. So what I think you're referring to is the cutting of the min relay fee, right?
Yeah.
So the min relay fee is not something that actually governs real transaction fees. The market dynamics do, right? It's the supply of block space and the demand for block space. And so if you want transaction fees to go up, you need to increase the demand for block space. The supply is fixed. That's actually the sort of defining feature of the way that Bitcoin works, right? So that the whole difficulty retargeting mechanism is designed to create a fixed supply of block space. So if you want the price of block space to go up, you have to increase demand for block space. That's the only way. Like, it has nothing to do with this like min relay fee stuff. The min relay fee is, again, a policy thing that just it diverges from consensus in a way that just makes it hard to predict how the next block is going to go down. And so like it's not super useful. It was, I think that the min relay fee existed because they didn't want people to be able to just spam your mempool with low fee transactions that were never, ever, ever going to get mined. And that, but you can set your own min relay fee, right? You can just, or your own mempool like threshold. It's not necessarily the best thing to do because if you're, depending on like what software you're running, if your node can't predict what the next block is going to be, then it can't do its own fee estimation properly, and then things can get weird for like layer 2 networks. But if that's not a concern, then you can just set your mempool fee threshold in like on your node to be whatever you want it to be, and then you can just drop all the transactions below that. Yeah, there's some network bandwidth that might get consumed in the process because it gets sent to you to begin with because your neighbors don't have the same relay fee set. But this, if the reality is that consensus blocks are confirming with transactions that are lower than the min relay fee, you have to lower your min relay fee in order to be able to see what the next block is going to be before it comes out. There's no way around that.
I promised to the listeners that you're going to reveal your number, and we're gonna announce if there's any winner to the prize from Cake Wallet. What's your number, Keags? Oh, drum roll. Is that
37.
37? Okay, let's see if there's a 37 in the chat. I'm sure that there is because a lot of people typed numbers. And new rule, if you're not here to claim your prize during this live stream, then you lose it. So if you just typed the number and you went away, or you have multiple accounts or whatever, and you just spammed the chat, I'm not gonna give you the prize unless you're here and you're gonna say, hey, I said 37. This is my prize. You should be active too, not just type numbers and then leave. I don't see a 37. At least not yet. Oh, there is a 37 from Clarissa69. That's a nice number. I'm sure that's not a girl behind the account, because what kind of girl puts 69 next to their name? No judgment there, by the way. There's a 36. I think that's the only 37 that we have. I'm still scrolling. So Clarissa69, if you're around and you want to claim your prize, you have to write a message in the chat and maybe put your address in your account description so I can send you the transaction. Once again, Cake Wallet, check it out. Thank you all for participating. There's a bunch of 36s, but as far as I can see, only 137. Yeah, I keep scrolling. A lot of these messages. But you also have a question, Keags, and I want to ask it. But I'm gonna get to it because I want to read it exactly in the way that it's phrased. It concerns the cold card hack and the fact that, oh, there's someone who said 37 a minute ago. I'm sorry. That's not how this works. So he says, Keags, what do you think about holding Bitcoin in hardware wallets after this cold card exploit when around 2000 BTC was stolen? Do you have any opinion about that?
My opinion's still forming. I will say this, like my current custody setup is very much hardware wallet based. It wasn't the cold card, but you know, it might be tempting to sort of dunk on or sort of be like, thank God I wasn't holding a cold card. But I think the real lesson to learn from this is that the cold card isn't necessarily unique. It's like the type of hack that happened against the cold card could in principle happen to any hardware wallet. Now, it's not going to happen later necessarily. It's whatever your seed generation was. But things like that, where bad entropy or just bugs in the firmware can make you vulnerable. And so I think the way that I'm thinking about this now is that you kind of want to have eliminate single points of failure at multiple levels. So I do keep a certain amount of Bitcoin on exchanges. I keep a certain amount of Bitcoin in cold storage myself. I'd like to be moving to I haven't done this yet, but moving to a stronger multi-sig setup for some of the deeper cold storage. The trouble is that almost everything that you do to make your setup more secure makes it less accessible. And so it's useful to kind of have this staged setup where it's if you lose the funds in one of these buckets, that the other ones remain. And similarly, you might want to have a slush fund that's more accessible, that's smaller, and the larger one in the more secure setup. That's the way that I'm thinking about it right now. I do think that at the end of the day, you can't really you can't throw out all hardware wallets just because of this, because at the end of the day, it's okay, well, what are you going to use to manage your keys instead? And hardware is fundamentally more secure than any software setup because you're just not subject to any sort of malware that not in the same way, and actually pretty much not at all, right? Because you can't really deploy malware to these hardware devices after they've been shipped in the same way that you can an old laptop. But the keys have to get managed somehow, and if even on the exchange side, it's like their keys are getting managed somehow. And so it's a problem that has to get solved one way or the other. And like hardware wallets of various kinds are going to be part of that. I think the best outcome of all of this is that we should see higher quality like verification used. And this is, something that I'm very excited about and what I'm spending my time on now. But like seeing better verification of hardware firmware, as well as like better UXs around multi-sig setups, so that that's not a huge pain in the ass anymore. I know that you've been very negative on dice rolling, and I understand where that comes from. At the same time, dice rolling for entropy generation is actually one of the better UXs, right? Because it's like very accessible. So I know that that wasn't necessarily a super conclusive answer, but like I said, my thinking on this is presently evolving. I think anybody who has like a very solid, I mean, there are going to be people with more experience than me that have a solid idea of what they want to do, but I think this is a good time for everyone to reflect on exactly how this should proceed. And I think it's like doubling down on this idea of no single point of failure is the right starting point.
So I have been very critical of Coldcard since they decided to change their license and basically get rid of the Trezor code that they inherited. They did a complete rewrite and they sort of locked it behind the Common Clause license, which gives no incentives to actually try the code or try to break it. And they also had no bounty program, like they would actually send you a mug and barely acknowledge your effort. So that was a major fault on behalf of Coldcard. And I know that there are some conspiracy theories right now concerning the Peter Gray guy and the fact that he had two different accounts with which he was signing with the same PGP key, and did they sort of try to imply that it was an inside job and it was not Rodolfo's fault and whatever. But Rodolfo was very toxic and very not open to any sort of feedback, especially if it tended to be on the negative side. And he also was very expansionist with his promotion and had pretty much every podcaster except for me promoting Coldcard. And I was not happy since I saw what they did with the license, and they called me a lot of names, and they got their usual shills like Odell and Shinobi to insult me on Twitter and call me dishonest and whatever. And it cost me a lot at the time. Like, people actually believed what they're saying because they have more authority. My point is that the people who have been holding their coins on something as basic as a mobile wallet, like a solid open source mobile wallet, have not been affected. Like, think Electrum or even something old like blockchain.com wallet.
Maybe. Here's the thing. Have not been affected and cannot be affected are two very different things. We are currently living in a regime where the AI models are really, really good at exploit development and sort of sussing out vulnerabilities that humans are just not anymore. I do think that this is a transient era because as people sort of use these AI tools on both sides of the fight, like the advantage will be restored to defense again. But I do think that it's going to be very messy in the meantime. This is why I think what Rob Hamilton's doing with the Bitcoin Red team is very, very important. And I hope to continue to see it. And some of my work touches this as well, right? Part of what makes the Coldcard attractive to hack is because it was so popular, right? So that's the other thing, is that it's not necessarily unique to Coldcard. It's that whoever the winner incumbent is, right, is going to be one of the most attractive things to look at vulnerabilities for. And so
I disagree there. Like, Coldcard is less than 10%. Like, you're in a bubble, obviously. If you look at the hardware wallet market, Ledger is the leader. They have like 60%. Then there's Trezor, they have about 20-25%. And the remaining 15-20% is shared by different companies. Maybe that Coldcard was the most popular Bitcoin only wallet, but I don't think they sold 1 million units or something. Like, ledger and
To be
Trezor
clear,
did.
yeah, I'm not necessarily comparing. When I said that, I'm more really comparing it to your sort of open source old like mobile wallet setup. It very well may be. Look, there's a lot of things that go into like whether or not these things are hackable. But I think it's not hard to. I don't think it's a controversial statement for me to say that the hardware wallets that have the most money on them are going to be the most interesting to try to attack, right? Like I think it's a pretty basic premise.
No,
Now they may
that's
not.
why there were so many physical attacks on the original Trezor, where people found ways, like they had $10,000 worth of equipment, and they were able to use that to extract the seed phrase from the original Trezor on an older firmware, and they have patched it since. They have security chips now that prevent that. But on the original design, that was possible, but it required physical access to the device. What
Yep.
was different about the cold card situation is that people did everything that they were told in terms of not connecting the wallet to their computer and generating their seed offline and using this PSBT system when they broadcast transactions, which means you sign on the device and then you take your SD card, you connect that to your computer, and you broadcast it separately. So they sort of did that, but what they did wrong was not have a long enough passphrase and also not generate their own entropy with dice rolls. And that was a feature that was enabled by Coldcard that is not available in most other hardware wallets, which to this day are still fine.
I guess my question. So all of that is true. What is the question here?
Well, the question is why are people so eager to defend Coldcard and say, well, it can happen to any other company when obviously they were very reckless and they were also dishonest in the way that they promoted their own
So
product.
don't get me wrong. Like I'm not a huge fan of the communication style of NVK. Like I just am not. Um, but as someone who has had to build these types of systems for a long time, I think it is. Look, when you say they're obviously very reckless, like I'm not familiar with all of the details of the development practices of CoinKite in general. So maybe they were, maybe they weren't. But what I'm saying is that even if you do everything right, the style of attack that has happened with the cold card, like the other hardware wallets are not fundamentally immune to. Other software wallets are not fundamentally immune to it. And I think it's not like it, the proof of this claim is that the fact that the Bitcoin Red team has unearthed so many vulnerabilities in so many projects who do all the right things should sort of demonstrate that this is the case, right? And so while I'm not a fan of the way that NVK sort of does his communication and sort of attacking online and whatnot, that my dislike of it does not make the fact that these types of attacks are possible elsewhere. It doesn't make that wrong. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I also want to provide extra context that this attack was not that obscure. It's not something that was enabled by the creation of Kimi K3 or something very advanced like Claude Fable or Mythos or whatever it's called. There was Greg Maxwell on Reddit who informed us that he was able to figure out that this can be possible to exploit using Quen 3B 27 billion tokens, which is something that any computer with 16 gigabytes of RAM can run. So it's not like it required something very advanced. It's just that the incentives for actually looking at the code were not there, and people
Correct.
believed much more than they took the time to verify what they're running.
Yes.
And this
Yes.
fallback, because ultimately the issue with the cold card is it was that if you did not generate your own entropy, it fell back to the system which had very weak entropy.
Yep.
So the issue is that people did not verify that and did not point it out on time. And of course there's a cohort of the people who lost money who are thinking of some sort of conspiracy, and they found some older posts on Reddit with people complaining that they lost their funds, and they were not sure why, and they're suspecting that maybe this was like a backdoor that was inserted by the developers with the purpose of possibly draining one wallet per year or something to make it look like it's the user's fault, but at the same time have a way to steal from users. I'm not claiming that, I'm just saying that it's something that people are talking about.
Well, so here's the question I want to ask about that, which is that let's suppose that that conspiracy was true for a second. What does that tell you about the way that you should behave, right? Does it say like, oh, well, clearly this was a backdoor and maybe the general security practices of open source software are fine and that we can proceed as usual? Because I think that is a mistake, right? I think this should, like, I think the correct lesson to learn from all this is that maybe it couldn't happen to everyone. Maybe some projects are doing so well and doing everything so perfectly right that this literally couldn't happen to them. But I still think even for those projects, it's useful for them to step back and be like, actually, what could we do better about our security practices? So this is why I shy away from this like conspiracy, is because even if it was true, it gives you the wrong lesson to learn. The lesson to learn is a whole bunch of people just got their funds stolen. Let's really unpack all of the ways that all of the things that had to go wrong in order for that to happen, and see if we can improve any one of those dimensions, or ideally all of them, so that we are less exposed to these types of things in the future, because they can happen to anyone. That's the reality of it, right? Like, you can't hide risk in this world forever, right? You have to address it for real. And like the traditional financial system does it by providing all these guarantees to consumers. And then like once every couple decades, you have a banking failure that you have to bail everyone out of. And then everybody pays a gajillion dollars in terms of inflation or taxes in order to make it happen. But the risk still happens. And in Bitcoin, some of that risk is in the way that the software is implemented. Some of it is in the social engineering attacks, like the what is it, like crypto locker stuff. Some of it happens in these like wallet drains. Every one of these crises is like risks, like latent risk coming to the fore. And it's, I think, important for everybody who works in this space to understand that this risk is everywhere, and that it is worth thinking about where it is and how it can be actually mitigated, not just hidden, but mitigated. And that can only happen if people take the attitude that it could happen to them.
Also, something that I want to combat at this point is the argument that I saw from some people when they observed what's going on with the cold card. What they said was, well, let's just search for the most obscure piece of hardware wallet on Alibaba or something, or Amazon, and we're gonna be using that because nobody will think to attack it. And that's the wrong way to look at it. That's security by obscurity, and it's usually very bad because it means that fewer people are looking at it. The most secure way, think about it in practical ways. A house is more secure if you have children playing on your lawn, even if you think that that's a bad idea, because there's gonna be more eyes looking at the children, and therefore your house is safer. It's kind of the same with walking in a crowd, right? You're probably more secure walking on the main street than walking on the back streets, because there are more people watching means more security. In security for, cybersecurity in general, using the software that is most battle tested and has the most incentives to break is also usually the best way to go and the most secure one. And I think that people running Bitcoin Core on their Linux laptop are better off than people running hardware wallets. Now, I don't think, for example, that the entry level, what's the admission technical proficiency for running Linux and Bitcoin Core on a laptop is very high. It's just point and click at this point. You just need a hard drive or a flash drive, a thumb drive or something to flash Linux on that device, and you're probably good to go. And if it's something that you wipe clean and you replace the hard drive, it's even better, because you know that there can't be anything malevolent in there. You can even remove the Wi-Fi chip or whatever if you're super paranoid, and it's gonna work out pretty well. In the case of hardware wallets, the ones that are most attacked and have been on the market for the longest are also usually the safest. That's why Trezor is so popular and the code base is so forked and copied by many of their competitors. And every time there's a new competitor that spins off a new product using the same code base, they have to provide support for it. They have to have developers who are managing the code base for their new product, and this means that there's going to be more eyes on the product, and if anything gets found they have to mitigate it, and the original creator is going to find out about what happened and also fix it. So this is, in a way, when I interviewed one of the co-founders of Trezor, he told me that in his previous career he was working on a Linux distribution, and it was one of those commercial ones. I think it was Fedora. And he said that there was Fedora and there was another one which was their competitor, and they did perceive each other as competitors, but on the other hand they were all working on the same problem, and it was almost like having a team that was separated in two that was trying to fix the same problem, and whenever one of them was figuring out something they would get that for free and they could
Yeah.
build on the efforts of others. And that's how open source works. It's not very intuitive because there's a lot of tribalism, there's a lot of competition between these companies. Each one has their own marketing that tells you that they're the best in some way. But the reality is that the original one that has the most pairs of eyes looking at it and the most experience with dealing with attacks is most likely also the safest.
I mean, I completely agree. In many ways, the resulting, like the result of this will cause Coldcard to be one of the most audited code bases in existence. That said, obviously the practices that allowed this to happen in the first place, like it's unclear whether or not they're still there, right? So like it's unclear whether or not the overall trust in Coldcard is going to go up or down as a result of this. And I strongly suspect that in the short to medium term, it's going to go down. But it is a fact that, like, you know, if it doesn't kill the company, uh, it will result in an improvement to its overall code base, its code base.
The reason why I sort of started this side note about alternatives to Coldcard that were not hacked is that I think for the average person, the onboarding experience of rolling dice or doing a multi-sig with multiple devices that cost $500 from different manufacturers or whatever is really unwelcoming, to say it very mildly. Like, just imagine telling a normie, like, oh, I'm gonna send you your first Bitcoin payment, but if you want to receive it, you have to walk through these loops, and then they're gonna be like, I don't want to do this, just give me dollars or whatever. It's too much. Just rolling the dice 100 times or having to buy some sort of dedicated hardware that you need to install in a specific way and then back up everything is too much work for just onboarding the network. And of course, you're gonna say that this is for long-term savings and it's not for something that you use for daily spending, and that's fair. But still, I think there shouldn't be this much friction involved. And if you look on the other side of the spectrum with the Ethereum users, for example, they have no issue holding their entire savings in MetaMask or whatever, and they harden it in some different ways with passphrases, or they use a ledger or whatever for hardware wallet. But my point is that they figured out a user experience which is welcoming, and they enabled the DeFi and the NFT mania, which consisted of a lot of normies entering the space and just doing what is cool, as opposed to having to learn how this actually works and what's behind all of this technology. And that's how adoption should happen, in a seamless way that doesn't get people thinking about what's happening out there. If you're using AI today, ChatGPT or Claude or Kimi or Quen, you don't have to listen to 100 hours of podcasts, and you don't have to get the opinions of experts to be able to use it properly. You can figure it out by yourself. Of course, there is no huge risk of losing anything except
Yeah,
for
I
your
think that's
privacy.
that's a very important distinction here, right? Which is that any security work behaves like this. And it's just an unfortunate reality of like the nature of security, which is you never know exactly what the right amount of paranoia is, because when it works successfully, you don't notice it, right? So, maybe I could have kept my house secure with a simple, like, sign that says, beware of dog, right? And maybe what it would take is like an insane like laser system, right, in my like foyer or whatever, that trips some alarm that has private security show up on scene like after 30 seconds if someone trips it. And you don't know where on that continuum is the right amount of security to make sure that you are safe for the duration that you're trying to be safe for. And so to that point, it's like the developers, their responsibility is to think of ever more unlikely and crazy attacks that could be done, and then offer solutions to them. And that's where these dice roll things come from. It's where all of the security solutions come from. But like no one, not even the security professional, especially not the security professionals, can really tell you like what the, in fact, or they can't really tell you what the right amount is. And in fact, the people who probably have the best intuitive sense of where the right amount is on the spectrum are actually like insurance underwriters, because this is their whole job, is to balance the cost of implementing the security features with the total like losses to be expected from those security features at scale, right? That is their bread and butter. That's what they know. But even there, like insurance companies go out of business all the time because they misjudge that. And so it's not fair to necessarily compare any sort of security type UX to something like AI, where it's just like, well, if you can get it to work, you can see it working, right?
Yeah, but my point is that the onboarding experience ought to be easier than telling people, well, you need to do this just to be able to receive and make sure that you're still gonna have it in 5 years or something. Or maybe that we need vaults, right? That's something
You
that,
absolutely, that's definitely true. You definitely need both, because the amount, because what we're talking about is the cost of onboarding. Because right now it's framed in terms of like the psychological difficulty, but you can think about it as a cost, right? If someone's got $1 billion that they're willing to secure, even if they're a normie, telling them, hey, you need to roll a die 100 times in order to make this happen, like they'll deal with that. And especially if it actually buys them a meaningful amount greater security than not doing so. So the amount that you put into the cost of securing the like whatever your setup is has to scale with the value that is stored in it. Like you can start out with $10 in a hot wallet, and then one day you might end up saying like, well, now I've got $100,000, and maybe it's time to like move to like a hardware wallet, or maybe you probably do that long before $100,000, but you get my point. And then at some point you're like, okay, well maybe I should move to a multi-sig setup, and maybe after that, like I want to move to some custom vault setup, and that scales as the value goes up, and that is the nature of things. This is not necessarily exclusive to Bitcoin, right? You can do the same exercise. It's like if I give you $10, you're going to put that in your wallet. If I give you $100,000, like now all of a sudden you have to think about like, well, which banks do I trust, or if I'm going to just keep it on my own, like what is my like home safe setup? Do I like bury it in my backyard? Do I put it like safe in the wall behind a painting? Do I have like biometrics on the safe? Do I use like a key plus a code
oh,
setup,
come
or
on,
just
it's 10,000. With inflation, it doesn't mean that much anymore. You barely buy a car.
my point being though, like it's not unique to Bitcoin, this property of having to scale the complexity, and uh, it's not even that you want to scale the complexity. It's that you just want to scale the security of the setup as the value goes up. And a lot of times, scaling the security requires scaling of complexity. Every once in a while, we make a breakthrough in terms of some security or UX technology that allows us to get more security for a lesser level of complexity. And people can and should continue to do that research. And so to your point about like it should be easier, I'm like, I agree. But I don't necessarily think it's a failure for people to try to innovate on the paranoia end of the continuum, because there are use cases out there that require that. And also, innovation at that frontier does often produce results that allow you to sort of steal some of that benefit and bring it back to like the median. That's true for all technologies, right? It's like the front, like, you know, in the AI case, right? The frontier model research is what allows the open source models to like distill their results, and that's what allows you to run it on the laptop. And without that frontier innovation that requires billions and billions of dollars to do that training, you probably wouldn't have open source models that are as good as they are. It's the same thing here.
I agree with that. Since you're someone who has worked on Jeremy Rubin's CTV proposal by developing some applications, do you believe that this is a good time? And I did see like a renaissance of the conversation about vaults, and that's something that CTV can enable. Can you explain vaults and whether or not you believe that they're a good idea for Bitcoin?
So vaults are this idea that you have non-human systems for governing like the flow of funds from like this like deep cold storage all the way up to the surface. Right now, you only like the way that Bitcoin works is that if you have the ability to spend the money anywhere, or like spend the money at all, you have the ability to spend it to any location. Pretty much all vault constructions involve you saying, hey, if I'm removing money from this vault, it has to go to the staging area first, where maybe I have some policy that like sends it back to the vault, or maybe I just require some like other different signatures in order to move it out. But the point is that it does not have a single like witness that you can produce that allows you to spend it to any particular location. So I think vaults in general are good. There's a number you can actually like create vaults today. Almost everything that you can do with CTV, you can already do at a much higher level of complexity, right? And so this is actually very similar to the discussion we were just having, which is that occasionally you'll have innovations where you can get the same level of security with a lower level of complexity. But right now, if you wanted to do vaults in the existing Bitcoin network, what you would need is pre-signed transactions where you deleted the private key. There are additional trust assumptions in that you wouldn't need in a CTV case. And then there are additional data retention things that that would be much harder to do with pre-signed transactions than with CTV. But in either case, like it is fundamentally possible. It's just not reasonably practical. And so having covenant constructions, CTV or otherwise, would allow you to do vaults, but it would allow you to do things even besides vaults, which are also useful. And this is actually why enabling these like very small primitives end up being, in my opinion, such a good way to improve Bitcoin, because it's like you can implement one small thing and get a whole bunch of different functionality that's now on the table for free.
Yeah. So, do you believe that activating CTV is a good idea? Because Saylor, apparently, after he announced that there's gonna be this $15 million fund for Bitcoin development, put out this Twitter thread where he announced that covenants are a bad idea because they add extra complexity. And it's kind of unfortunate, and it gives you a signal that he's gonna be someone who opposes the activation of any covenant soft fork. But it does seem at this point that we could have avoided this cold card hack if people also used vaults on top of their cold storage setup.
I don't. So let me say a bunch of things that are all true. Number one is I think covenants are a good idea. I think that covenants do increase complexity at the level of consensus, definitionally, because like you're adding more checks to consensus. I think covenants will reduce the overall complexity of the things that covenants are used to build, because again, like what you can like trying to build those same systems without covenants is going to be much more expensive on the complexity budget if you try to do them with the existing technology. And I also don't think that having covenants in Bitcoin would have solved this cold card thing. Not because they couldn't, but because I don't think the cold card users would have been like, you know what, I really want a vault set up, but because I don't have a vault set up, I'm going to just use the cold card. And the reason I believe that is because like they could have used a product like Casa already, right? That like would have prevented them from being hacked in the way that they were. And that is the level of complexity that like you're dealing with when you're starting to talk about vaults. So I don't think that they're in the same customer cohort, right?
Right. So I do have to ask you this also. What is a good way to do covenants without CTV or without any of the no, I don't mean covenants. I mean vaults. To do vaults without covenants. You said that there are
Um,
some complex ways today. Is
yeah.
Liana wallet one of them, or do you not consider the lock
So
times and stuff like this to be vaults?
so Liana is probably actually the best deployed one that I'm aware of. But I need to caveat that with saying like I'm not deeply familiar with all the internal mechanics of uh Liana specifically. So you have to remember my background is like I'm a protocol developer. I'm not a wallet developer. So I don't know this, that, or the other intricacy of how this wallet implements something versus this wallet implements something versus some other. The things that I'm familiar with are that I know what primitives certain opcodes allow and what are needed in order to uh, do those same actions without those primitives. And so if you do not have CTV or some other covenant-based opcode, you can emulate them using pre-signed transactions. So like, let's say, so what a covenant does is it fixes the output location. It says like, hey, if coins are leaving this, UTXO, they have to go to one of these three places. Now you could do that with a covenant opcode that specifies those three things, or you can do it with three pre-signed transactions, and then you delete the private key for the UTXO that would allow you to pre-sign other transactions. But I think anybody listening to that should be like, well, what happens if you didn't delete the private key? Or like, you have a toxic waste problem where that if it doesn't get deleted properly, that your covenant or like your covenant in quotes construction falls apart. It also means that the data that you have to retain, that if you lose those pre-signed transactions, you lose the ability to actually do those same things. So like CTV offers, or like covenants in general, offer like higher compression ratios on the data that you have to retain, and can allow for cleverer ways of like storing maps to your covenant locked coins that pre-signed transactions would just be a lot more expensive on. And then similarly, like you don't have a toxic waste problem with covenant constructions that you do with like pre-signed transactions.
That's a good explanation. I think we have two more topics that I really want to touch upon. The first one is the two upcoming hard forks, what you think about them. And the second one has to go back to our Lightning discussion and specifically what we said to each other on Twitter. And it's kind of unfortunate that we got sidetracked so many times that we haven't had the proper Lightning conversation, but I also think that what we said so far is very useful and productive to anyone listening. So which one do you want to tackle first?
Either we can do the lightning one.
Right. So what I said on Twitter, what I remember that I said, and you can correct me, I don't want to search for the tweet right now
Yeah,
because it's going to take long, was that a good factor for measuring the success of the Lightning Network is the amount of Bitcoins locked in the Lightning Network, which right now there are two sources. I'm not sure which one is accurate. There's one ml.com that says there's 2,637 BTC in network capacity. And there's mempool.space that says 3,836 Bitcoin. The difference is like 1,200 BTC, which is a lot. I don't even know why there's this variance. But my point is that this is less than 1% of the network capacity. And you say that it's irrelevant.
What's less than 1% of the network capacity? Oh, of the 21 million Bitcoin.
Yes.
Yeah. Um,
I meant supply, not capacity.
Yeah, I am firmly of the opinion that that TVL, like total value locked or whatever, in the case of Lightning, is not. I mean, I understand why people use it as a success metric, and I think to one degree of approximation, it's useful as one, but it's fundamentally a cost metric. And uh, the because if you think about what the value of the Lightning Network is, it has nothing to do with how many coins are locked up in it, right? In fact, for vaults, I think that would be a much better metric, right? If you said like, wait, because the whole point of vaults is like what they're securing, and so if you said like, well, 50% of the network is like locked up in vaults, it's like that's a pretty good endorsement of those vaults. But the value of the Lightning Network is in what it transacts. And in fact, the more that you can transact with less value locked, the better, because the value locked is a cost metric. It's not a value one, right? Because if I can transmit millions of dollars of value with only locking up like thousands of dollars of value, then that's a much more efficient construction than if I'm transmitting a million with like having to lock up a million. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
So that said, if the value is zero, it means that no one's using the network. That's definitely true. And number two is that like if the total value, if the TVL going down is also commensurate with less value being transacted on the Lightning Network, then that's also bad, right? So insofar as the TVL going down actually means reduced economic activity on the Lightning Network, then that is a statement that the Lightning Network is not delivering as much value as it was before. But again, the metric to pay attention to is the amount of value transacted, not the amount of Bitcoin locked up in Lightning channels. In fact, this is actually a really important point, which is that if you have a very big Lightning Network with a whole bunch of like value locked up in these channels, but that value is never moving, because people just like they got really excited during plebnet summer or whatever, and they put a whole bunch of coins into these channels, and then they never transact on those channels. Then that Bitcoin is like dead weight and in a more vulnerable position than if they had just had it locked up in cold storage. So in some ways, you might expect for the TVL to go down over time as you start to prune away the roads that are not being used. Saying like, hey, well, we built out this infrastructure to go to from A to B, but no one actually wants to go from A to B. So we might as well reclaim the resources used to build that and then deploy them elsewhere. And so even if the overall transaction volume of the network was fixed, reclaiming resources that are going unused is actually better for everyone involved, and actually does not in any way say that the network itself is failing.
But it does mean that the network itself becomes more centralized, or at least concentrated in a
But not really,
few
right?
large nodes.
So if you build a whole bunch of like edges on this network that never get used, is it more decentralized than if they weren't there?
Well, it's about the routing, first of all, because this is an important part. Like, you don't want the same free large nodes to route all or a large percentage of the transactions, right?
Why?
Well, first of all, they're gonna collect most of the transaction fees, and that sort of disincentivizes everyone else from participating. Secondly, I'm not an expert in this, but I'm assuming that it can be bad for privacy also, if you're gonna have all of these nodes collecting information about how many transactions there are on the network.
So the second one is true to an extent. Like obviously the Lightning Network has a lot of privacy technology built into it in terms of like what can actually be learned from doing the routing, and it's not very much, but it's not nothing either. The second one is that like again, this is sort of contingent on the claim that if those edges, those decentralized edges never get used, then it's not really distinguishable from the scenario when they weren't there. That said, it's like maybe if one of these central nodes go down, you still have the option. So as a sort of backup plan, it is useful. But then it's that you have to think about the opportunity cost of that capital. Like, the question is like, is it better for the network overall that capital gets used to like reinvest in other ways? Obviously, if it's just sitting in cold storage, maybe not. But I think a lot about the goals of decentralization are very much about robustness, right? Its ability to withstand different types of failures, different types of betrayals, which is just a particular type of failure, and efficiency, which is about not using more resources than you need to. And these two things are like fundamentally at odds with each other. But a radical commitment towards decentralization is also a radical commitment towards inefficiency. And inefficiency is sort of by definition not costless. Like, it is expensive. To do the same job with a lot more resources means that you don't have those resources to spend on other things. And where on that continuum ends up being the right answer is kind of it's anyone's game, right? And the more risk that you are exposed to in the world, the more that you might want robustness, whereas the less risk that you're exposed to, the more that efficiency might rule the day. And it's actually all about efficiency at the end of the day anyway. It's just efficiency even when you start to consider these like outsized like tail event scenarios where like very rare and costly events occur to you. So for me, decentralization is a means to an end. Again, it's about the freedom to transact, and like it's the permissionlessness of it all. So yeah, if you only had one routing node that you could route through and they decided to just cut you off, like that's really, really bad. But if you the difference between having five separate options and 1,000 separate options, especially when it is truly permissionless for anyone to enter the game, that doesn't bother me.
So back to the TVL, which means total value locked, if I'm not mistaken, argument. I'm pretty sure, I don't want to speculate too much on this, but I'm pretty sure that at least a handful of people who have been on the podcast own more Bitcoin than the total amount of Bitcoin that's locked in the Lightning Network. So if they really believed that it's a good way to scale Bitcoin or it's useful for themselves, they would open a bunch of channels and they would make the network more decentralized and provide more routing routes for everyone else. But they don't.
Why? See, this is what I mean though. Like, it's like this would be true if the demand for the transaction volume itself is greater than what the existing capacity can provide. And so this is actually best represented by payment failures. So in my opinion, like the best metric for whether or not the Lightning Network is healthy is a declining payment failure rate. That is like the number one important thing.
Okay, when was the last time you made a payment with Lightning and it failed?
Probably years ago.
Really?
Yeah.
Which setup are you using?
So at the time, I was using like a raw LND setup with Zeus plugged into that.
Because I'm using something which is not custodial. It's Phoenix, so you do open your own channels, but it is hosted. So you do use their servers for broadcasting the transactions, and you do open the channels with their own large liquidity pool. So in theory, their node is very well connected and should be able to send transactions to any part of the network. They should be able to find your route. It's just that I had lots of instances where this did not work out, and also in the last year or so.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to contest your experience.
And then Matt Corallo told me that if I'm honest about this and I'm not lying, then I should provide logs. And then I said, well, I'm not comfortable doing this and normalizing the practice of exposing what kind of transactions I'm doing with whom and what time and whatever. Like, I don't want to give out free information about my wallet just to get an explanation as to why this failed.
I mean, that is a fair thing for you to refuse, but also as a developer, it's hard to be able to improve the situation without the information of how it failed, right? Now, it doesn't necessarily need to come from you, but it does need to come from somewhere. So if they're not experiencing it and you are, it means there's something different about your setup than theirs, and they would need to see something like that in order to improve those situations.
Well, yeah, my point is that in my experience using Lightning, even sometimes with custodial wallets like Wallet of Satoshi or whatever, I still get failed payments. And maybe it's because of a bad internet connection, maybe it's for lots of various reasons. It's just that I never. So I don't use my card for payments or whatever because I hate it on principle. I try to avoid it as much as I possibly can. I use cash as much as I possibly can. But when I see people paying, like, it becomes very embarrassing when you're in a supermarket and you're tapping your card and for some reason it doesn't work. It gets declined.
Yep. Yep.
And if we do want to use this for payments at scale, we have to get to the point where this is less than a 1% kind of occurrence.
Probably a lot less than 1%.
Yeah.
Right? 1% is 1 out of every 100. You see 100 people a day. Means you're seeing payment failures every day. I would like to be even better than that, but like, I think your point's well taken. So my contention when I responded to you online about the TVL thing is not so much that the Lightning Network is perfect and that it needs no improvement, or that it is satisfying the demands of using Bitcoin as a medium of exchange in everyday transactions. It's none of those things. It's simply just that TVL is not a good metric to use to decide whether or not the Lightning Network is succeeding or not. Payment failure rate, great one. Transaction volume, great one. TVL, not a great one.
Okay, let me ask you this, which is sort of related to our conversation, but also fantasy. So it does not concern the reality, but if you had this magic wand, right, and you could make any change to Bitcoin whatsoever, just one change, it can be adding something, it can be modifying a parameter or whatever, what do you think that would be?
It would probably be to get simplicity into Bitcoin.
You mean Blockstream's scripting language?
Yep.
Do you think that improves any of what we're dealing with? Do you think that makes Lightning more reliable, or that it enables better vaults than what we have today?
So it is undeniably true that it allows for better vaults. There, and this is a very heady argument, but it's just like, it's the world that I live in, which is that if I only get one wish, right, I kind of want to make sure that that wish is the most general tool possible to be able to solve all the other problems. And to my knowledge, there is no more general tool that has been proposed for all of Bitcoin than simplicity. It gives us the ability to do sort of arbitrarily flexible like scripts and contracts with the ability to also formally verify their correctness. And it the trouble is that it's not the most efficient thing in the world. And like, don't get me wrong, there's still many problems to solve for simplicity to be viable. And it's unclear to me whether all of them even have good solutions. But it is the tool that allows the most number of other things possible. And the general tools are the ones that allow us to solve novel problems when they crop up. You can't purpose build tools for every problem.
I agree with that. I just expected you to say CTV or the Great Script Restoration or the
GSR is
package.
probably the Great Script Restoration might be the closest thing off of simplicity. It's just not nearly as good.
That's interesting. So adding a bunch of opcodes, you think that's worse than activating simplicity?
So worse, to be clear, it's worse because it's not as good. Not worse because it makes it worse. Does that make sense? Like GSR would be an improvement to Bitcoin. I want to make that clear. I am in support of GSR primarily because like it's a much easier sell to people, right? Both from a marketing perspective and from a technical perspective. But the theoretical maximum is just not nearly as good as something like simplicity.
If someone came up with this proposal to increase the witness side of the SegWit block from, I think right now it's 3 megabytes on top of the one that we have, and take that to 16 or whatever, would you be in favor of it? If it helps open more lightning channels or more L2 connections, peg ins, peg outs, whatever.
I don't know that we're bound by that right now. I mean, I see it's a little outside my wheelhouse. It's because here's the thing, right? People like to get religious about it, but the block size war isn't really about the fact that the 1 megabyte or 4 megabytes or whatever is the one true size. It's just that you don't want to increase the block size as your primarily scaling strategy because it just doesn't work, right? Once we have other solid scaling strategies that give us like multiplicative factors on the base layer stuff, then we can start to have a little bit of a more sort of mature discussion about what the right level of block size increases given the hardware availability that's out there. So to that end, I am not fundamentally against block size increases, but I also don't know enough about the different like how those parameters will affect the hardware for like IBD and for like keeping up with the network in order because I know that like witness verification, once you've done it, like you can just drop it and it doesn't have like the same level of overall increase in pressure that like a base block size would, because anything that appears in the base block size can influence the number of changes to the UTXO set, and that has ongoing operational load just from that alone. Whereas like the witness, it's like once you've verified it, you could sort of drop it and forget about it completely. But this is stuff that I would generally want to defer to people who work on Bitcoin Core to really like answer some of those questions about what the right parameters are. But in principle, to answer your question, like block size increases are fine. It's just that they can't be your primary scaling strategy because
Even the
they're
Bitcoin Cash people agree with that because they settled to 32 megabytes and said that anything beyond that point is just not good enough, and they need to figure out better ways, and that's when they started activating a bunch of opcodes. And that's why now they're far more advanced in terms of being able to multiply large numbers and being able to do covenants, and they can have a much better version of Lightning or rollups or whatever. It's just that there's not market demand for it, but technically they were able to develop their protocol to a greater extent, to which we're still trying to get with BTC.
I mean, yeah, that's one of the benefits of having a much smaller user base, right? Is that you can get away with doing a lot more, a lot quicker. But I
Yeah,
think
but they
this,
also had less funding, and they also got called out for being scammers. And I don't think there's a project that received as much hate as BCH. And we did craft these narratives and said, well, it's just libertarians who don't understand how Bitcoin works that left for that project. But to their credit, they did a good job, which is not
well,
something that someone
how
like
are you
Greg
defining?
Maxwell would acknowledge. But
I mean, like, look, I have not studied like Bitcoin Cash since they forked off because like this is the
that's the
main.
thing Jeremy Rubin did, and that's where CTV comes from.
Okay.
And they
I
also
mean,
did a more complete taproot migration. They also have a lot of cool stuff that we only wish we had in BTC. And my question is, what if we see it in like on a live network with the incentives that it works, and we can try to break it with Kimi or whatever, or just deploy some technical users to try to deploy it, and why are we not copying their homework? Because to me, Bitcoin maximalism is about being able to do everything, not limiting
yeah.
the use cases and saying, well, this limit on the block size and this limit on what you can do with transactions and whatever should be in place, and let's just virtue signal about having the perfect system. There is a lot of research and development that's happening outside of Bitcoin. That's fine. But
I don't disagree with any of
in
this,
my view,
but
if something gets enough market traction and there's obviously a clear evidence that there's going to be users coming to Bitcoin and paying transaction fees to do that, maybe we should think of ways to bring that to Bitcoin as opposed to just pointing fingers and saying, well, they're shitcoiners and it's not going to work.
right, but like there's nothing about what I've said in this entire interview that would suggest that I'm doing
No,
what you're
there's not.
suggesting.
I'm just providing context to the whole conversation because I know people who, for example, are very religious about the block size limit, and they say that it's just as sacred as the 21 million coin limit, and that's
That's
really not
really
true.
dumb.
Yeah,
And in fact, even the 21 million coin limit is not necessarily the important part. The important part is a non-discretionary monetary policy. And so it doesn't matter whether it was 21 million or if it was like constant inflation. I mean, it might matter at the margins, but the problem is like if you change it once, then you can change it again. And changing it is how we end up with fiat currency.
I 100% agree with that, but I also present the example of the November 2008 version of Bitcoin that was something that was being circulated among the early participants, and that was Hal Finney, that was Ray Dillinger, that was James A. Donald, and there were a couple of other guys who mentioned it and wrote about it. And that one had 100 coins per block rewards. It also had halving cycles that were happening every week. And also, there was something different. So if you added up the amount of coins that you would get in that setup, it would add up to 20 million. So 21 million, I believe, was just an accident of having 50 coins per block every 10
Yeah, of course.
minutes and the halving cycles every 210,000 blocks.
The important part of 21 million has nothing to do with 21 million. It has to do with non-discretionary monetary policy. Because the trouble with discretionary monetary policy is that if you put someone in charge of deciding what coins should be issued at what schedule, that person now has a lot of power and they become like a source of corruption. If you just set it and once it's set, it can't be changed, then it eliminates this like corruption vector. And that's really, really important. But whether it's 21 million or, 10 million or 100 million or something that increases at 1% forever, or maybe it increases at 50 Bitcoins forever, right? So it's not necessarily a percentage based inflation, but a fixed inflation, right? All of those systems would work and solve many, many, many of the problems that we have with fiat currency.
And to zoom out from this perspective, I tend to say this a lot lately. I used to be a fanatic of dividing everything by 21 million, and now I understand that most likely that's not going to be possible. But if that's going to be 21 million Bitcoin and maybe 100 million Monero and 21 million Zcash and 21 million, no, I think it's 84 million Litecoin and 100 million Ethereums, and they all add up to like 500 million coins. And that's like a fixed supply of the currencies that are out there. And the policy is clear and is not changing. And if it does change, there's like an adjustment in the price that compensates for the fact that they're not honest about their monetary policy. I think that's a lot better than the system that we currently have, where you have a central bank that makes changes on the go every quarter or whatever. They get together and they say, well, let's adjust the interest rates, let's adjust this and that completely changes the dynamic of the economy. So if we have something open source that is auditable and is plural in the sense that we have multiple networks with different monetary policies, it's still much better than what we currently have with governments playing with their toy money, printing, and whatever.
Completely.
Like, I'm not against a system like this where you just swap between a currency and the other, or just exchange like you do Forex today. And I don't think it's the end of the world if Bitcoin does not end up doing everything.
I mean, it literally can't do everything.
Well, if you look at it, like if I was Super Testnet, right? Super Testnet is this guy who's like, no, I can do this on Bitcoin. Bitcoin can have this. It's just that it has its different trade-offs, right?
Yeah, yeah. I was kind of being a little snarky, but it's like every choice that you make forecloses on all the alternatives you could have made, right?
I'm
So
very happy with this answer, to be honest.
yeah,
Of course, there's gonna be someone in the comments saying we're shitcoiners, but that's fine. We're
I mean, I okay.
But speaking of shitcoiners, what do you think? And this can be the closing question if you're tired or something. But what do you think about the upcoming hard forks, which is gonna be the BIP110 one by Luke Dash Jr. and the BIP300 one by Paul Stortz?
I honestly could not care less about Luke's fork because I don't think it actually improves anything in any real sense. I am cautiously curious about how the drive chain stuff ends up working. Um, I I've kind of gone back and forth on drive chain for the many years that I've paid attention to it about whether or not I think it'll like solve interesting stuff. But I think it's super interesting laboratory experiment, and I'm excited to see it play out at a production level. But you know, I'm not certainly buying into it. Like I'm interested in it as a technologist. If I'm trying to allocate capital, like I'm certainly not rich enough in order to put any serious amount of money into it because like I don't think it's well proven. But these experiments are how civilization learns, and so I'm glad that he's sort of taking a respectable sort of bow out of not trying to make it part of Bitcoin, but at the same time still honoring his commitment to his own beliefs and not trying to like. I don't think he's like everything about the way that Paul has marketed the fork itself has been, in my opinion, like decent, right? He has not always had the best communication style when it comes to calling people stupid about not believing in his ideas, but at least he's not trying to pretend that like his hard fork is the real Bitcoin or whatever that uh, Luke does on the regular.
I also think that these two are like the perfect antithesis or whatever. Like they are so opposed in their philosophy. There is the BIP110 fork, which is reductionist, and it says we should not do this with Bitcoin, and we're gonna keep patching it to prevent spammers from using this network. And on the other hand, you have the drive chains fork, which is maximalist in the sense that it tries to maximize everything that it can do. And if
Yep.
there is a new use case that comes along, they can have a sidechain for it and see what the market thinks and just run it. So one of them is trying to reduce the use cases, the other one is trying to increase them.
Yep.
But for
And
some
I
reason,
firmly
one gets
believe
more
that
attention
the
than
second,
the other.
yeah, I believe that the second hand wins in the long run.
Yeah, and we're gonna learn from it. My only hope is that we actually learn from these experiments and I mean, once again, it's not gonna be the end of the world if we get a bunch of parallel networks, altcoins that are supplying for the demand that the market has, and we're gonna have like 500 million coins. But it would be useful if Bitcoin actually improved and added some of these features from which we learn from other networks.
Yeah, completely agree.
So, is there any message that you have for the listeners or anything that you want to promote?
Well, so let me talk a little bit about what I work on because you know this topic is or this conversation has been a lot about Bitcoin specifically, and what I am working on is currently Bitcoin specific, but it's not necessarily like limited to that. But I think the what your listeners will be interested in is that what I work on is formal specification and verification, and I am very interested in making sure that the software that we run does what we think it's going to do, which for anyone who's written software before knows that it's shockingly difficult to make sure that like it does only what you expect it to do and nothing else. Anyone who's ever been hacked has experienced this. Anybody who's ever, you know, written software and a bug has occurred and something weird has happened understands this. And so for a network that is as well capitalized as Bitcoin is, um, you know, at upwards of $1 trillion worth of market value, like it's very important that we understand exactly how it behaves. And current software development practices, even in Bitcoin Core, don't give us the level of assurance that the software industry in general is actually capable of producing. And so what I'm very excited about is trying to build or like bring these practices of formal verification and specification to Bitcoin. So what I've been working on is a project called BTC Verified. I haven't been able to touch it for the last month or so because I've been out traveling for conferences, but literally this week is actually the first time that I'm getting back to it. But what it is a formal model of Bitcoin's consensus rules so that we can better understand them, so that we can better actually change them safely and analyze how proposed changes might affect the network. Because right now what happens is that people debate each other on the forums, whether it's the dev mailing list or the like delving Bitcoin, and they'll have arguments that either only the people there are aware of. And so as newcomers try to come in and contribute to Bitcoin, all of that institutional knowledge gets lost. And then secondly, sometimes people make hand wavy arguments about what a proposed change will do to the system without actually being able to specify in a great level of detail what that is and why it occurs. And this can actually prevent having healthy and productive discussion about whether proposed change is going to do what it says it's going to do, and whether or not that the sort of second order or like the side effects of that change are something that we want or don't want. So the whole project is really just around trying to make sure that we better understand how Bitcoin actually behaves and how the software achieves the protocol expectations we have out of it, so that we can, steward the development of the protocol more safely. I don't expect most people to get involved with this project because it is extremely highly technical. But if you want to, like, I do encourage anybody who's interested to look. This is not me trying to repel people from taking a look at it. It's just that it's an acknowledgement that it is one of those things that requires a great deal of like technical interest and skill. But I would love to get more eyes and interest on it. And so yeah, you can take a look on GitHub. It's like BTC Verified. I can send you a link and you can put it in the show notes or something.
Sure. So another question that stems from what you just said: which conferences are you attending this year? Where can people meet you in person? Say hello.
I'll be at TabConf this year. And I think that's the only Bitcoin conference I have planned. The ones that I was just at was not Bitcoin conference related. It was like formal logic and mathematics conferences. So the other side of this, like if you view what I'm doing is like I'm taking advanced math research and trying to bring it into Bitcoin in order to make the software more safe and secure. So I spend some of my time at Bitcoin conferences because that's where the demand side is, and then I spend some of my time at these math conferences because that's where the techniques come from. And so I was just in a sort of chapter where I was doing some of the more math stuff and less of the Bitcoin stuff.
That's actually productive. And I actually think that a lot of people working in Bitcoin should take a step back and learn other fields of science just to be able to apply them into what they're doing or get a fresh perspective on what they're already doing. It can be very productive. I'll also be at TabConf, and I spoke with Michael Tidwell, and if everything goes well, there's going to be like a marathon live stream happening there with this podcast, and people can just drop in after they get off stage and talk about what they just said, or we can have gossiping or whatever. It's going to take a long time of just sitting there and talking, and it seems like that proposal got approved. I hope the Wi-Fi is just good enough for the live stream. That's my only concern. But otherwise, I look forward to having you on the show after your talk at TabConf.
Sweet. Yeah. Thanks, Vlad.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. You're much nicer in person than you seem on Twitter when you're just replying to people.
Who is it?
Who isn't? That's a good point. Remember, Twitter is not real life. Come to TabConf, come to real conferences where you meet the people in person. Have a drink, and you're gonna understand what this is really about and how people are actually different in person. So yeah, pay me commissions, Michael Tidwell, if I sell any tickets. Thank you everyone for listening. This has been my interview with Keags. You can follow him on Twitter. I think it's @proofofkeags. And I don't know
Yep.
if you're on Noster, but some people use that.
I'm
It's
not. I
popular.
probably should be at some point, but I'm not. But yeah, my Twitter and my GitHub are both Proof of Keeks.
There are 2 people who guessed 37 in the chat. I'm gonna contact you after the show. And thanks to the sponsors once again: Braiins, Hashpower, SideShift.ai, Cake Wallet, LayerTwo Labs, and OrangeRock. Thank you. I'll see you in the next one.